Well, hello, Garland Nixon here, and I am live. I'm broadcasting on StreamYard, which is a blast. And I'm going to talk about Empire today. We're live on Facebook Live. I'm also on YouTube, and I'm also on Periscope on Twitter, in fact, right now. So if you are on any of those platforms checking me out, make sure that you share. I would prefer, everybody personally, I prefer if you go to my YouTube page and watch this, go to my YouTube page, Garland Nixon, share, and make sure you subscribe and hit the little bell. If you hit the little bell, that will get you notifications. So please, the more the merrier at my YouTube. I'm working to do I'm working to do more webcasts, and I've got plenty to talk about. So let's get this going. What am I going to talk about today? If you know me, you know I like to take different perspectives on things and more historical perspectives. So let's talk about the United States as an empire. I think one of the reasons that so many people get confused about the United States, one of the reasons people get so upset and confused. And I'm trying to get the comments. I don't know. Maybe somebody's can't post comments to some. There we go. There's people. And my main man, Coop W, Luca Clemente. Everybody's there. Wow. So I'm going to talk about the U.S. as an empire, and that is different than the way people see this nation. So let's talk about the definition of an empire: a political unit having an extensive territory or comprising a number of territories or nations and ruled by a single supreme authority. America is you can't understand America unless you see it as an empire. If you see it as a democracy or a republic, and let me say this, most people don't know the difference. You know, the funny thing is, a lot of people will say, oh, America's a democracy. And then people will say, no, it's not, as a republic. And if you know, listen to my shows, listen to me on the radio, you know what Garland Nixon's going to say. Garland Nixon is going to say, because I always want to make sure people know what the hell they're talking about. And always, I guess maybe I'm just a wise ass. I want to point out when they don't. And I'll say, hey, you say America's not a democracy, it's a republic. And they'll say, yeah. And I'll say, what's the difference? And they can never tell me. I can want to get into it, but that ain't important because it's neither. It is neither. It is an empire. So let's talk about the American empire and what it is and what an empire is. Let me give you an example of how people don't understand America. Let me just give you an example, right? So people say, hey, let's bring the troops home from Iraq. Let's bring the troops home from Afghanistan. Let's bring the troops home from Syria. Let's bring the troops home from country X, right? And then America doesn't bring the troops home. And people are like, well, let's fight for them to bring the troops home. Let's argue. We got to get these troops home. The troops aren't home. How can we get the troops home, right? Well, there's a reason that the troops aren't home. And unfortunately, my dear friends, the troops ain't coming home. I don't care how much you petition the government. I don't care how much you mark. I don't care how much noise you make. Empires don't bring the troops home. Think about the Roman Empire. They're out there marching. They got hundreds of thousands of soldiers, maybe 1 million soldiers, and they come upon a city. What are they going to do? They're going to take that city. They're going to conquer that city. They're going to take the gold. They're going to take the resources from the city. They're going to say to that city, you are now under the emperor of Rome and you are now part of the Roman Empire, right? Because what does an empire do? It goes out, it finds other lands. An empire goes out, it finds other nations, other countries, other cities, whatever that has stuff. And because the empire has a bigger military, it takes them, it puts them under the empire, and it now says to this new country X, you are now part of the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire ain't giving up country X. Somebody has to take country X from the Roman Empire, right? Once the Roman Empire gets to the British Isles and takes the British Isles, they ain't giving up the British Isles. The British Isles are now part of the Roman Empire. If you see America as an empire, you'll start to say, oh, wait a minute. Oh, whoa. We're saying bring the troops home from Afghanistan, Syria, right? That makes sense, doesn't it? And then we got to ask ourselves a question. Did we bring the troops home from Germany? That was 1945. Have we brought the troops home from Japan? That was 1945. Have we brought the troops home from Korea? That was 1953. Do you see what I'm getting at? If you see America as a nation, as a democracy, then you will say, well, we have gone to the country and we have gone to war with that country based on whatever I told us. How about we start this? The reason they tell you for going to war with the country is a lie in the first place. So if you can't believe them at the front end, you sure as hell can't believe them at the back end. If you can't believe your government when they tell you why they're going into Iraq, don't believe them when they tell you why they're not leaving. You know why they're not leaving Iraq? For the same reason that they ain't leaving Germany or Japan or Korea. Think about that. 1945, Germany is plenty able to defend itself. The idea that the Russians are going to come through the Baltics to Germany is absurd. It is ridiculous to argue. Look. Right now, the Russians have this big pipeline. Russia's country, Russia's main gas company, Gazprom, supplies a third of the natural gas for Northern Europe. And it has a pipeline that runs through Ukraine and it goes to Germany. Now they're building a new pipeline called Nord Stream 2, $11.5 billion. It runs from Russia to Germany. It's going to make it easier. It's going to make it cheaper. Russia's going to be happy. Germany's going to be happy. Germany's got this big, think about this. Germany has almost a $12 billion economic deal with Russia. Is it realistic to think, yeah, Russia's going to come right across the border and attack Germany? It's absurd. But for an empire, it has to make sense, right? So we have to say, we're afraid that the Russians are going to come get the Germans so we can leave troops there. But in reality, here's what it really means. An empire sees countries, two types of countries. An empire sees countries that it has conquered, and it's going to put bases in the countries that it's conquered. And it sees the world as countries that it intends to conquer. And it wants to surround the countries that it intends to conquer with bases so that eventually, when the time is right, it can conquer those countries. So it's going to make up all kinds of bullshit lies and excuses as to why it has the bases there. Of course, they're defensive. Why that country is going to come after us. But an empire is on the move. An empire is ever growing, right? So why? From the perspective of the empire, we have conquered Germany, and the evidence that we've conquered Germany is that we have bases there. So now we can say we have to have bases there to protect the Germans from the Russians, as if the Germans can't protect themselves, which they can, but that's a lie. We got bases there because we've conquered Germany as an empire, and we see Germany as a conquered land. We have bases in Korea. Why? The Korean War. And once we conquered Korea as far as we can say. So we got a base there. But the empire sees Afghanistan. People are like, my God, we've been there for 20 years. We've been in Germany and Japan since 1945. 20 years ain't nothing. Here's the bottom line. If you think we're ever leaving, you don't understand the nature of an empire. If you think you can somehow go out to the streets and march and petition your members of Congress and the U.S. is going to turn into something other than an empire, you're fooling yourself. It ain't happening. This is an empire. Empires conquer lands, and empires do not give up those lands. The empire sees itself as having conquered Syria because we got troops there. Not quite conquered because they haven't overthrown the government yet, but they intend to. We've conquered Iraq from the perspective of the empire. Look, recently what happened? We're like, we want Iraq to have a democracy. Well, that's a lie. That's a complete lie. But we said we want Iraq to have a democratic government. Okay, so Iraq has a democratic government. They voted 170 to nothing in their parliament that the U.S. military had to get out. 170. So their parliament, we're like, we want democracy in Iraq. So Iraq has democracy. Their parliament votes unanimously. The troops got to leave. They send a letter to Mike Pompeo. The troops got to leave. You know what Pompeo's answer was? We really are going to do good here, and we're looking forward to staying a long time. In other words, screw you. Oh, really? Your parliament voted 170 nothing, 170 nothing for us to leave? We're an empire. We have conquered your country. You can't tell us to leave. We will never leave. You are a conquered land and we will treat you as a conquered land. Afghanistan, you want some kind of a deal? It ain't happening. See, one of the reasons they were mad at old Trumpy, there's a myriad, but one of the reasons they were mad at old Trump was this. Trump didn't understand what I'm saying. If he did, he would have never said to them, he said to the people around him, perhaps we should bring the troops home from Korea. That told them that he didn't understand the nature of what he was supposedly running. Right? When he started talking about setting up a deal to bring home the Afghans from Afghanistan, to leave Syria, etc. Right? Trump would have done it. He didn't give a crap. He didn't give a crap. He's got a lot of issues, but he didn't give a crap. He looked at it like, why are we spending all this money? But it wasn't about the money. The empire doesn't care about money. The empire is about conquering countries, conquering lands, taking their resources, and then looking on to more lands that the empire can conquer. So Trump didn't understand that he was running an empire. He had to go out of here. Now, Joe Biden clearly understands it. The second day Joe Biden was in, the second day, a column of military vehicles headed into Syria. Because Joe Biden's thing is, hey, we haven't conquered Syria yet, and we are an empire, so we got to conquer Syria. Well, that's very dangerous because Russia has 2 bases in Syria, and of course, we could all end up in a nuclear war and dead. That is why I could make an argument that the Biden administration's foreign policy is more dangerous than the Trump administration's foreign policy because it risks nuclear war at a much higher level. Now, Trump's foreign policy was horrific. It was horrible. It was knuckle dragging apehood, right? But, and they really risk things with China because China's a nuclear power. So that was stupid. Now, the Biden administration, being an empire, is going to risk nuclear war with China and Russia. So they're even stupider. So they're even more dangerous, right? But that's the nature of an empire. An empire is not logical and reasonable. An empire is about greed and power. More. Now, so let's go on. So now we've discussed why the U.S. didn't leave, won't leave any conquered nations, right? Can't leave them. We're an empire. Once we conquer the nations, we ain't leaving. Once you understand that, you understand you're wasting your breath even asking. Okay, so now let's move internally. And let's try to explain what's going on here, right? The empire protects itself. Think of the empire like you would a corporation, right? The government creates this corporation. It's not a real person, but the government calls it as a person, but it's an entity out there. And the entity has rights, and the entity can do things, and the entity, and people work for the corporation. They say, I'm working for such and such corporation. I'm dedicated myself to make this a better corporation. The corporation is theoretical, but it is there because it's been created by the government. It is an institution. It is a theoretical institution. You can't touch it, but there's things there to make it evidence that it lives, shall we say. That's an empire. You can't touch or see the empire, but the evidence is there that you are in an empire. And America is the empire that claims it's not. It's just part of the American empire is to claim we're just a bunch of do-gooders going around the world helping people. But the giveaway that we are an empire, the giveaway is that America argues that constantly that it has unlimited power in the world, that we can go arrest Julian Assange and charge him with an American law, even though he did things in another country. But the Russians, the Chinese, the French, the British, the Venezuelans, the Canadians, they can't come to America and charge somebody with something that happened in their country. But we can go to their country and charge. Why? Because we are the world's empire. That's why we see ourselves. So let's come home. The empire protects the empire. Institutions look out for the institution. If you ever worked at a college, you know, if you've ever been a professor, I've taught criminal justice before. If you've ever worked at a college, if you ever worked for an institution, when you work for an institution long enough, you understand that the institutions look out for themselves first, right? So look at an empire as an institution. Because the empire, think about this, when COVID happened, right? You would have thought, hey, the government is going to look out for the people. The people are maybe getting sick. The people they've been told to stay home. They can't work. They can't make a living. So you're thinking the government's going to deal with them, going to address them. No, that's not what the government did, is it? But what the government did do is protect the empire. We got to protect the bases in Iraq to make sure they don't get attacked. We got to protect the bases around the world. And what else did the empire do? The empire, remember, The empire sees two types of countries: countries that it has conquered and countries that it intends to conquer, right? So the empire, if you would have thought about the people in this country, you would have said, well, how are we going to deal with the plight of the people? They're hungry, they're losing their houses, their lives, their jobs, they're struggling. What are we going to do? But the empire only thinks about the goals of the empire, which is to overthrow more countries. So what did the U.S. do? Let's crank down the sanctions on Venezuela. Let's crank down the sanctions on Iran. The empire sees everything as an opportunity to expand the empire. So the empire didn't say, how are we going to help the people? The empire said, how are we going to strengthen and expand the empire? These are countries that we can take. We can maybe take Iran. Well, maybe if they get hit hard enough by the pandemic and they really suffer, then maybe a lot of them will die, and then we'll get their oil. Yay! That's the way the empire sees things. It is amoral. There are no morals. It's only, what can I get? How can I get it? What means do I have to take another country and hold it? Remember, that's why we don't leave. From the perspective of the empire, we took Japan, we conquered Germany, we conquered Korea, we own them. The empires conquered them. We got bases. We're never going to leave. Now we've conquered Afghanistan, we've conquered Iraq, we got bases there. We're never going to leave. And in countries like Qatar, where we have a huge base, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, where we have huge bases, if they will allow us to have bases there, from the perspective of the empire, we got them conquered. We ain't leaving. If Qatar said to us, look, you guys got the biggest base, your biggest base in the Middle East is in our country, we want you to leave it. We'd say, no, we ain't leaving. No, we've conquered your country. You don't understand. You ain't in charge of it. We are now. We're an empire. The empire rules, right? So now that the American people, if you look at the pandemic, the American people were suffering. And what happened? The American people looked at the government and said, look, dude, you just spent $4 to $7 trillion. Within 2 weeks after they locked everybody else down, they did the CARES Act, which was $5 to $7 trillion, right? That they spent, and within 2 weeks, and they gave that to the richest people on earth, to the oligarchs, to their donors. Those are the kings and queens and noblemen of the empire, right? They gave them to the rich people. But as for you, screw you, you're out of luck. Right? When the U.S. when the people were hoping for some kind of the $1,200 check, the $2,000 check, some kind of check, that people were like, we need money, give us something, right? And the empire was like, the Congress was like, and this was interesting. So Congress was like, look, we're hopelessly deadlocked and we can't get anything out to help you people. I'm sorry. The Republicans, they won't work. The Democrats won't work together. Nobody will work together. We can't get it done. I'm sorry. We're just hopelessly deadlocked. At exactly so if there was something for you, Congress was hopelessly deadlocked. But what were they able to do for the empire? At the same exact time that the empire could not come up with a dime for its citizens, right? To alleviate the misery of its citizens caused by the empire's lockdown. That was their decision. Might have been the right decision, might have been the wrong decision. I'm not talking about lockdowns. That's not what the show about. That was the decision they made. And as a result of that decision, people couldn't survive, people couldn't eat. They couldn't get together to come up with money for these people. But what could they do at the exact same time that they were arguing that Congress was deadlocked and they couldn't come up with money for us? At exactly the same time, they passed a $740 billion Pentagon budget with a veto-proof majority. That means 2/3 of Congress could get together at the same time that Americans were literally in food lines waiting to be evicted, many being evicted, homeless, tent cities all over LA, all over the place. And what do? $740 billion. That was for the empire. That's what an empire does. To keep they were like, okay, the people need money, but the people said, whoa. What about the empire? Well, if we're going to keep conquering countries and hold the ones we have, we need another $740 billion. Done. That's yours. Go ahead. Continue overthrowing countries, going around the world, taking everything you can, stealing resources. Congress was like, here's your $740 billion. You got yours, empire. Take yours. Give money to your friends, do what you're going to do. But now let's get back to the American people. The American people are suffered. Screw them. They get nothing. That's what they get. Nothing. You see, in difficult times like this, Here's the truth. The American people are just a problem for the empire. See, the American people are like, hey, the government is for us. This is our government, by the people, for the people. It's here and it's listening and it's going to work. That's not how an empire works. An empire focuses on taking care of the empire and taking care of the oligarchs that feed off the empire. And the people are, look, if a war starts, you can go out there and run through the desert and your bullet can catch a body. I mean, your body can catch a bullet. That you're good for that for the empire. They can throw you out there by the hundreds of thousands and you could get mowed down by machine guns. The empire's great. Well, good. We got rid of a bunch of hungry mouths to feed. They're happy. You can keep your mouth shut and cheerlead war, right? When they're going to take over the next country, you can get a bunch of flags and put them up around your houses. You can put yellow ribbons on your oak trees. Remember, there was a stupid song, tie a yellow ribbon around the old oak tree, right? Tie a ribbon around the oak tree for when the mangled soldiers come home or their bodies come home in caskets, right? You can do that kinds of stuff to support the empire. As soon as you are not supporting the empire, you are of no value. You can be a cheerleader for the empire, right? Meanwhile, as the empire is going normally, when we're not in a COVID or whatever, they will burn you for fuel. You can work somewhere and you can keep their profits rolling in. That's it. That's it. That's nothing. Rodion Press, but we're just assorted varieties of cattle to them. That's all we are. We are fuel to be burned by the empire. That's what the working class, the working poor, and the poor. Fuel to be burned to keep the empire going. Keep your mouth shut. And once you stand up and say, I would like, I don't know, some food, I don't have any, you're a problem. So now what's going on? The empire knows what's happening internally. Look, Avril Haines. Avril Haines. You know what's interesting about Avril Haines? There was this thing called, I think Bill Gates headed it. It was called something 201. And it was in last December or something. And what it was, Jareth Kopis, my man, the man who wrote a great book for Ukraine, Forever a Pawn. That's one you ought to get. Great book. But so they had this thing about what would happen in a pandemic. It was called something 201, whatever, right? And what's interesting, Avril Haines, who is the DNI, the intelligence advisor to the president, right? She was like all over that. You should go watch that. What is it? Something 201. Somebody can probably tell me what it was. Event 201, I believe it was, where they talked about pandemics. Avril Haines was all in that, talking about this is what we should do, this is what we shouldn't do, etc. And now she is the president's right-hand person, and she is a sick, very sociopathic neocon. But at any rate, so where we are now is the American people are struggling, and they're in a bad way. A lot of people, a whole gigantic class of people. If you worked in any particular jobs, you're screwed. Your job is gone, right? Yes, it was a tabletop exercise. Event 201. A couple people have told me. Look for Avril Haines, who is now the DNI, Defense, whatever she is. But I forget. I always forget what that acronym means. But whatever it is, she is second in charge. She is the She is the intelligence advisor to Joe Biden. So what's happened is now that the American people are struggling, the empire is looking at it and it's saying, not only are these sons of guns going to bug us for food and shelter, which we really don't have money or time for that because we're trying to conquer some other countries here, they may start rising up. See, if you look at the and I'm going somewhere with this. You should listen to this. If you look at the George Floyd protest based on just George Floyd, you won't really get it. Because if you look at what happened, the protests, let me start with these protests way back. Remember, there were protests at state houses. There was a protest in the state house in Michigan against the lockdown, right? Then there was the George Floyd protest all over the country. Look, let's face it. I'm a black person. It ain't unusual for a black person to get shot by you remember the police or killed by the police. Eric Garner. It's not unusual in this country for some black person to get taken out by the police unjustly and for nothing to happen to them. So we've had marches before and we've had protests, but nothing like this. They tore this country apart from one day. They were burning stuff down. It went up. People were flipping out, right? Why was that? right? Well, let me throw this in. There was 42 million people unemployed. There was tinder. There was dry tinder, and all you needed was a spark, and whoosh, you got a flashover. So if you just look at the George Floyd protest based on what happened to George Floyd or Black Lives Matter or Antifa, you don't get it. Let's move forward. So we had, in the beginning, we had protests in Michigan about the lockdown, and I argue those are people because you didn't give them any money. What were they supposed to do? Stay home and die and starve? Unlike other countries, they didn't give people money and the opportunity to survive, right? So they were like, hey, we want out. We're getting kind of hungry here and our bills need to be paid, right? Okay. So all of these people are out there and you've got one protest after the other, right? Then remember you had in Seattle some weird thing where they took over some blocks or something, right? And you had the protests, January 6th. Here's what I'm getting at. If you look at any one of these protests, DNI, Director of National Intelligence, thank you, third eyewitness regarding to Avril Haines. If you look at any of these protests individually and just say, well, based on this protest, well, here's what's going to happen. If you're on the right, you're going to look at lefties protesting and say, something's all screwed up. If you're on the left, you're going to look at the righties protesting. Oh, they're just so screwed up. But what happens when you're Garland Nixon? And you're not like right or left or this or these are the good guys. Oh, I got to blame it on this person, that person. You're just evaluating it. Here's what you see if you're Garland Nixon. Over the course of the damn year, everybody has protested over the last year. People have went nuts the last year. People on the right freaked out on the streets. People on the left freaked out on the streets, burnt shit down, broke stuff down. People on the right went to Congress, broke shit down, went crazy. People on all sides of the aisle have just completely gone berserk the last year, right? Well, why was it? It was because the U.S. did a bunch of lockdowns and didn't do anything to mitigate the economic suffering of its people. That was the issue. And the people were lashing out. And if you get out of your right wing or left wing box, you'll realize that everybody was lashing out. And here's what they know. It ain't going to stop because the empire doesn't give a crap about its citizens. So the empire is not going to do what it needs to do to alleviate the pain and suffering economically of its citizens. And that's going to increase exponentially. And when it does, there'll be people in the streets again. Right? There will be right wingers. There'll be left wingers. There'll be strikes. There'll be people marching against things. There'll be people marching for things. There'll be violence. There's going to be all kinds of crap. So remember this video. Don't come to me with like, well, this violence is by George Soros. No, this is the Proud Boys. Don't come to me with that crap because I told you this upcoming violence is about an unstable empire that refuses to mitigate the suffering of its people that it has inflicted upon its people. Okay, so let me go. So why am I saying that? And that is because right now the Biden administration has some legislation and they're calling it the Domestic Terrorism Act. And if you notice, what do they keep saying? Well, the Avril Haines even said that. Well, before it was ISIS overseas. Now the terrorism has come home. What is that saying? We will now use the means of the empire. We will use the power, the military, the mechanisms, the violence that we used overseas. Yeah, we'll use it home right now because the empire defends itself. The empire doesn't care, doesn't like, hey, well, those are Muslims over there. But sadly, there are people here who don't understand they're an empire. So when the U.S. says it's going to bomb country X, they're like, yeah, we got to take out that evil dictator because they don't know that they are next in line. Yes, the empire gives them some lie. Yeah, that guy over there with all that oil in his country. Yeah, well, he's an evil dictator. Really got to take him out, but while we're there, we'll probably take the oil and Exxon and Shell will take it all. So they're going to take some country. You as a sucker are going to support it. And then all the money and your son and daughter is going to get killed in it. And then all the money that comes out of that country that they just overthrew. Yeah, you ain't getting none of it. Your job is to be the cheerleader for war, to be a sucker and believe the lies they tell you to drag you into war, and then clap and tie a yellow ribbon for your son or daughter, and then say they're a hero when you go to their grave because they got blown up by an IED because the U.S. wanted to steal oil. That's your job. And as long as you do that, the empire's okay with you. So now they got these domestic terrorism laws, and Biden's putting them out, right? And so here's what's going to happen if you're on the right. There you go. The lefties are out to get us. And if you're on and these idiots, the resistance, now that it's their turn for power, they're going to be like, well, The Proud Boys and the Boogaloo Boys really are tough. So I guess we've got to listen to our leaders, and we've got to listen to Congress, and we've got to put these laws in place to give them the tools they need to deal with the Boogaloo Boys and the Proud Boys. And you idiots, those tools are going to be dealt with you also. It's funny, a lot of conservatives, I said, look, when the George Floyd people were marching and they were like, AG Barr, he's like, yeah, we got to crack down on them. Why? We'll charge them with sedition and federal crimes. They're like, oh. And people on the right, yay, they're going to crack down on them. Yeah, and Trump is like, yeah, I'm going to write this executive order that says they can get 10 years for defacing a public building. And people on the right, like, yeah, stop Antifa. And I'm like, you fools. Anytime you give the government more power, it's going to come back to haunt you. So what's happened now? Brilliant people on the right that supported the government when they were cracking down on the George Floyd, BLM, Antifa, whoever, right? And now what are they doing to the protesters in January 6th? They're going to charge them with sedition. They're going to charge them with this other crap. They're going to use those same rules to crack down on them. And now they want a domestic terrorism law. And they're arguing, oh, yes, we've got to do it because these far right-wing groups must be cracked down on them. And here's what the bottom line is this. You don't need a domestic terrorism law because terrorism is already against the law. If somebody does terrorism, charge them with murder, blowing something up, trespassing, stealing, terrorism, bomb making. There's every law you need, but it ain't good enough for the empire because the empire feels threatened. And the empire wants to cut a protest off before it starts. Mark my word, when you read those domestic terrorism laws, here's what they have in there. If you start some kind of a protest and anything happens, you can go to jail for 10 years. So if you and I say the government's cracking down on us, this is unfair, let's have a protest. So we go there and we protest something unfair that we feel the government's doing. Censorship, it's cracking down on us. We can't go online, whatever. We do a protest. So Garland and you, Coop, Anthony, Third Eye, whoever, we do a protest. So here's what the government says. Well, at that protest, somebody threw a bottle and there was property damage. You are responsible for it. The people who started the protest are going to jail for 10 years. That's what it's really about. So what do? Now people are afraid to muster a protest. They're afraid to put people together to have a protest. Why? Because if you're the leaders of a protest, if anything happens at that protest, and all they got to do is have one of their people, one of their, agent provocateurs throw a rock, hit somebody in the head, some cop slips and breaks his ankle. Oh, a cop was injured. The people that started the protest, you're going to get 10 years. Some cop injured, right? That's the way it works. So my point being, and I will kind of wrap things up by going here. If you understand that you are not in a republic, that you are not in a democracy, that you are an empire, then you understand that the United States as an empire only sees two types of countries that it has conquered, such as Japan and Korea and Iraq and Afghanistan, etc., and that it has bases in it, and it's going to defend the lands that it has conquered, right? And countries that it intends to conquer. That would be Russia, China, Venezuela, Bolivia, Cuba, etc. So if we don't have bases there, if we don't have a puppet government there, then we intend to take that country to put a, quote, friendly government in and to put bases in there. That's where we are. And what happened? The U.S. started with the smaller countries, right? But they've gotten most of the smaller countries. So now they want to move on to the big stuff. It was inevitable that the U.S. was going to confront Iran, confront Venezuela, and confront the big boys, Russia and China. It was inevitable because as an empire wants to rule the world, it works up to bigger, bigger, and bigger. The problem now is they got nukes. And to confront Russia or Japan is to confront the annihilation of all humankind. But because an empire is not logical and reasonable, an empire only knows one word: more. And sadly, that what shows you that the American people do not understand that they are either in an empire or that they are, or the nature of an empire is that Americans are still asking the empire to bring troops home and to end military conflicts in nations that the empire has conquered. If you understand, empires never do that. Forget it. The troops ain't bringing home. Now, what you need to start doing is discussing the fact that it's an empire, getting it out into the conversation, getting it out into the public conversation. This is an empire. So that way, when people say, "Hey, let's do a march to bring the troops home from Afghanistan," you can say no. That's a waste of time. This is an empire. Empire's conquered Afghanistan. It ain't giving it up. Let's do a march to protest the fact that we're a damn empire, and understanding that the government doesn't care the crap about us, that we are nothing but an inconvenience. And particularly now, because it's difficult, we are a bunch of extra hungry mouths to feed. Nothing more for the empire, nothing more, but a bunch of extra hungry mouths to feed. And the government's like, man, look, Joe Biden comes in, and what does he do? He is like pure empire guy. What does he do? Within one day, within 24 hours, they're sending extra troops to Syria. And he clearly, Joe Biden said, if we get both Senate seats in Georgia, $2,000 checks will go out. That's what he said. The checks will go out. $2,000 checks will go out. Afterwards, he's like, oh, I got your votes now, huh, suckers. So let me tell you, this is what it's going to do. We're going to give you 14. We ain't giving you 2. I know we said 2, but that was a lie. But fuck you. You ain't getting 2. Who cares? We got your votes now. Number 1. Number 2, we'll maybe March. Right now, we got to impeach Trump. We're busy impeaching Trump. That's what they're doing. Now, why? Who knows? It's funny that they're all in within days. They got to impeach Trump, but it could take months. People are about to be thrown out. People are starving, but it could take months to get you your food. But it only takes a couple days. Why? Because Donald Trump offended the empire, right? He did things the empire didn't like. I'm no Trump fan by any stretch of the imagination. You know me. Both of these parties are just 2 brainwashed cults as far as I'm concerned. But here's the reality. He did and said things the empire didn't like, and he wouldn't recognize that it was an empire. And he said things like, let's bring troops home from this country. And they're like, oh my God, this is an empire, you idiot. Don't ever say anything like that, right? And so the bottom line is, when it all came down to it, now they've got to destroy Donald Trump. And when his followers, the small group of them, went to the congressional complex and wandered around in there and occupied the congressional complex for a while, right? That embarrassed the empire to the world and exposed it exposed not only the fragility and the brittleness of the U.S. government, because they're going to say our democracy. This ain't no democracy, but the weakness and the reality of the U.S. government and the United States grip on power to the world. But it embarrassed people, and it exposed that our lie that we go around the world saying we're the beacon of democracy and we're trying to bring everybody democracy. It exposed that it's a bunch of crap, that we're really just a pirate ship going around stealing everybody's resources. So Donald Trump embarrassed the empire. He said things the empire didn't like. He wouldn't acknowledge the empire. And so now he must be destroyed for all time, so that anybody who sees, don't you ever embarrass the empire or you're gone. That's it. So the Democrats immediately, who are the Democrats are the tip of the spear for the empire. The Republicans are to some extent, but they're kind of caught up in, they're just a totally screwy party. The Democrats are a nasty, nasty machine right now, a nasty empire machine. The empire has come together, Silicon Valley, Wall Street, the military industrial complex, social media, the national security, international security state have all come together in the form of the Democrats. That's why you're seeing the level of censorship. That's why you're seeing the level of the crackdowns, the military, all that. Why? Look at the Democrats not as a party. Look at them as a tool. Look at them as a conduit. Look at them as a pipe through which the power of the empire flows. They're nothing. They're a bunch of, climbers, right? A bunch of people who want more power. They're greedy, but the empire works through them. They benefit. They get to live a nice little cushy life. The empire gets what it wants. So the Democratic Party does what they want. Good enough. The Republicans, Trump came out of the Republicans. So the people in power are like, he's not an empire guy. He's got to go. All of the power flows through the Democratic Party right now. That's very, very dangerous. And so what we end up with is right now, we don't have any parties. We've got 2 brainwashed cults. We've got 2 cults where the people who run the parties, both of them, have been feeding the people in the parties absolute lies. And sadly, you can't see it unless you get out of the party. As long as you're in one of these 2 brainwashed cults, you're a brainwashed cult member. And each brainwashed cult says, no, the other ones, they're the ones that are irrational while we're rational. Well, there ain't no such thing as a rational cult. And if you were believing that this is a nation and that somehow that this empire is going to bring troops home from a country, or could, or that Donald Trump had the power to. Yeah, you're misled. It ain't happening. At any rate, here's what I'm going to ask you. I'm going to thank everybody. And then Christopher says the military catastrophic blunder will eventually occur. Well, the fact of the matter is, one of the things that happens, before I go, one of the things that happens with empires when they get to the end is they get involved in a lot of fruitless wars. They get involved in foolish wars. And of course, they get involved on many, many fronts, and they end up crumbling. The only thing, the problem with this is, this country's got nukes. And what happens? We've never had an empire with nukes crumble before. And we've got a sick group of bastards running this country. So there ain't no telling what they'll do at any rate. So I'm not trying to scare you, but that's reality. What the heck? You know, we're in the middle of a pandemic, and we've got a crazy government, a crazy empire. And this country is as broken can be, because it's an empire. That's why people don't even know it. So spread the word. Look, this video is going to be on Facebook. It's on Twitter, and it's going to be on YouTube. But it usually seems to me, when I do these through StreamYard, it takes about 24 hours. It takes at least 12 to 18 hours before this video will pop up on YouTube. I'll share it then. So unfortunately, it's going to be a while, but it may be up sooner. I don't know. At any rate, but I will share it on Twitter. Share all of this stuff with your friends. Please go to my YouTube channel and make sure you subscribe to the channel. Share it with your friends. Tell them about it if you like it. There's plenty to be said. And enjoy yourself, online, have fun. I don't have any way for people yet to help me out. I'm putting together a studio right now. I'm just in my little home office. Believe it or not, you know what's behind me? I bet you won't believe this if you're into music. That, my friend, is a signed album, and the album is called Jeff Beck's Guitar Shop. And that's an original album signed by the, Cream people on there, Jeff Beck's Guitar Shop. I bought that years ago. There was a guy named Boogie Wineglass who owned this chain of stores called Merry-Go-Round. He went bankrupt, and he had to sell everything that he had. And I went to his estate sale, and I bought that. I ain't going to say how much I paid for it, probably way more than I should have, but I didn't buy something. I mean, he had like Jimi Hendrix albums, originals signed. This guy was very, very wealthy. Signed Beatles albums, originals signed. And I think back like, oh my God, why didn't I buy that? I mean, they were like, at the time, I was like, oh, I don't know, $500 for a sign. Oh, they want $1,100 for an original signed Beatles album. That's too much. I don't think I'm going to do it. This was like in the 80s, right? But so foolishly, I didn't. Can you imagine right now if I had like Hendrix, Beatles signed albums? But I do have Jeff Beck's Guitar Shop, and I ain't giving it up anyway. I don't care what it's worth. At any rate, so peace, save it. At Garland Nixon on Twitter, make sure you follow me. Garland Nixon on Facebook, make sure you follow me. Garland.Nixon on Instagram, make sure you follow me. If you want to email me, GarlandN, you see that's Garland, my name there, and the first letter of my last name, GarlandN@gmail.com. And last but not least, thank you very much. And I will hopefully be back on tomorrow. Peace. Don't forget, sign up, share, subscribe, hit the little bell on YouTube. Peace. I'm out.